The concept of comprehension is one that is incredibly complex, and we could probably talk about it for 6 months and still not fully capture everything that is influenced by, or that can influence, the comprehension, reading comprehension in particular, of the pupils in our classrooms. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of this highly complicated topic, and also leave some links that I think might be useful to you to further examine some of these concepts. So what do you think about when you think about comprehension? How would you define it? What is reading comprehension? Many people start with this idea that it's understanding the words in a text, and that's absolutely the beginning to this idea. We expect from our pupils that when we're talking about reading comprehension, that if they read something, they have some kind of understanding of it. And we test them in ways like asking them to retell the story. We ask them to answer questions about the story. But what's really important for teachers to understand, and for pupils, is that it's not a passive thing that's happening. We don't just understand by reading the words. Comprehension, at its core, is an active process. You would know this if you are kind of distracted, or you're tired, or not really interested in the information that you're reading. You might find that you can read an entire page and then stop and think, well, what did I just read? I have no idea. That's why it's an active process. As readers, we need to be actively interacting with the text in order to have comprehension happen. So do you talk to your pupils about this? Have you considered that simply giving the text does not ensure that comprehension is going to happen? One way to think about this idea of active learning, or not so active learning, active comprehension, is to think about what affects comprehension. And in the literature generally, we talk about 2 different types of factors that influence how well we comprehend. The first type of factors are reader factors. That is, they're things that are intrinsic or a part of the reader. Okay. So one of those things is the reader's background knowledge. If you asked me to read a text about blood types or skin diseases, my comprehension is very likely to be low in that text, because I don't have understanding of those issues outside of this text. I would need some opportunity to build some knowledge around that before my comprehension could be at the level that you would probably want me to understand. So when you think about the comprehension of some of the concepts, some of the text that you're giving, think about whether or not your students have the background knowledge around that. And a simple way to support comprehension for this effect is to think about giving opportunities to look at that concept first before reading a complicated text about it. Another factor is vocabulary. It's incredibly important to have a deep, broad vocabulary in order to have good comprehension. So part of this goal towards being an active comprehender is to build pupils' capacity for words. Learning new words every day, talking about words, and building what we call word consciousness, which is that kind of interest and desire to learn new words. It's incredibly important. Next, we need strategies and skills. And some of the literature differentiates between the 2 of these, being a skill, something that you can identify no matter what the type of text it is, being able to find the main idea in a paragraph. for example. Whereas strategies are things we have to employ strategically through a text in order to comprehend. And there are a number of strategies that have been found in research to be necessary for effective reading. You probably have heard about these. Things like connecting, synthesizing, summarizing, inferring. These are the sorts of strategies we need. Now, what we know from research, again, is that children need to be taught these strategies specifically, explicitly. It's generally not something that we kind of come with in our bag of tools as readers. So some of your comprehension instruction time should be in the teaching of these comprehension strategies. Additional to this is probably I think the thing that is missing from many classrooms where the focus is on comprehension, and that is fluency. Fluency is the ability to read quite quickly, accurately, and with expression or prosody. Now, as a reader, if you do not have fluency, you are less likely to be able to comprehend the story because you haven't captured that the knowledge of what's happening as you go through with slow, inaccurate, or expressionless reading. In fact, some researchers say that the children we think of as having comprehension difficulties are actually more likely to be having fluency difficulties. One way you can have a look at this and check this is whether the children are able to comprehend a story that's read to them. Let's see if some of that comprehension is able to be done when we take away the effort of the fluency. If fluency isn't in your lessons for literacy each week, then that's something that you'll need to do straight away. Lastly, motivation. This is a factor that influences the comprehension of a text, and you'll know this yourself. If you are not motivated to read something, if you haven't got a purpose for it, or you're not particularly interested in the topic, or it's difficult for you, then your motivation can be influenced. And that, of course, is going to have either a positive or a detrimental effect on our motivation to read, our comprehension. The other type of factors are text factors. So these are the things that the text brings with it. We just spoke about the things that the reader brings. Now we think about the things that the text brings. And generally we see three types of text factors here. One of them is the text type. Okay, whether you're reading a narrative, whether you're reading a report, or something that's about information. And in general, we seem to find that narratives can be a little more easy to read. You know, your concentration doesn't have to be 100%. You can kind of weave in and out of the characters and the stories and still keep an idea of what's going on. Whereas if you're reading to learn from a scientific type of text or non-fiction text, it can be a little bit more difficult. And sometimes the grammatical elements of that text can make it quite difficult too. You can have long noun groups or verb phrases that can really complicate the reading. The next type is text features. These are things like the contents page and the glossary and reading diagrams or tables. So sometimes different types of texts have features to them that we're supposed to gain information from. And if we don't have the skills to use those features, it can influence our comprehension in a negative way. And thirdly, text structure. And in this case, not necessarily what we would think of as the generic structure of a text, but this thing called top-level structure, where a writer, usually at paragraph level, will complicate the paragraphs by using a particular kind of skeleton. These are cause and effect, problem solution, description, compare contrast, and I always forget one that I can't remember. I'll get back to that. I'll put a link below. And we've got beautiful research here that talks about pupils' knowledge of these structures being able to help them to comprehend, but also to be better writers, which is really interesting. So think about all of the things that you do in the classroom that are related to these aspects that you might never have thought of as related to comprehension. Well, they are. So now we have a more broad understanding of comprehension because we have the reader, we have the text, and comprehension happens somewhere in between those two things. The things I bring with me as a reader, the things that the text has within it, and somehow in the middle I've got to meet and turn and think and wonder in order to comprehend. Now, the other thing that we need to remember is that comprehension isn't just one level of understanding, and that particularly in today's day and age, when we have to be very aware of the things that are written, we need to make sure that we have different levels or abilities to be critical, to consider who is telling the information, what might their hopes and wishes might be for where that information goes and how we understand it. So critical literacy comes in here. And one way that we can do that is to think about the types of questions, not only that we ask of our pupils, but that we teach them to be able to ask of themselves. One fabulous way of doing this is the QAR method, which is question, answer, response. In this method, we teach pupils about different types of questions. You might have heard these: the right there, think and search, author and me, and on my own. Some questions that we might ask of students are right there in the text, meaning you could point your finger to it, whether it's in the picture or it's in the text. Some answers are found by thinking and searching. So it might be that some of the answer is on one page and some of the answer is on another, or some of the answer is in the picture and some is in the text. Then we have the author and me, where the author's giving me some hints, but I need to bring my own background knowledge, my own understandings of how the character might react or what might happen in that event to be able to give an idea of what might be happening. And this is where inferencing comes into play, doesn't it? And lastly, the on my own questions are ones that don't necessarily relate exactly to that text, but relate to the idea that it's giving. So, for example, we might say something about the role of females in fairy tales. So we're not necessarily saying, okay, we're talking about the book of Cinderella, but we're talking about this other big idea of females and how they're represented in texts. That's an on my own sort of question that you could ask. The teaching of comprehension is incredibly complex as well, but all of these elements need to be a part of your literacy program in order for you to get the most out of those experiences. So have a think about it. Do you make vocabulary an important element in your classroom? Do you think about what the students need to understand before they come to a text about the main idea, about the main concept that it's about? Have you thought about how they're motivated, whether it's through choice or whether it's through a text that's at a level that they're comfortable with and that they can have some success in reading? Have you thought about fluency? If it's a text that is not at a level that they can read with some accuracy, with some pace and with expression, then you're not really going to be supporting them to make independent comprehension. have you explicitly taught the comprehension strategies? This means that there would have been 4 lessons showing your pupils how to connect to a text. 4 lessons on how to infer, at least. And we completely go over and over these, don't we, as teachers? So that you've modelled it, you've shared in the use of the strategy, you've guided them to do it themselves, and then you have opportunities for the pupils to do it themselves. Comprehension strategies are essential in having success as a reader. You probably do it without thinking. Okay, one thing I'm going to say here about connecting, because this is a favourite of teachers. You know, we quite often get really excited when we ask students to connect to a text. And if you're aware of connecting like I am, you know that we ask them to connect text to self. That is, I find something in the text that I can relate to as an individual person. Connect text to text, where I say something like, oh, I've read a book by Anthony Brown that has this kind of story in it. And I can make links between my text I'm reading now and a text I might have read before, or a different type of text, a book to a movie, to a poem, that sort of thing. And then the third one is connect to world, where I might be reading about refugees in a picture book, and I understand that outside in the world there are issues with how countries are supporting refugees, and I might be able to add some of that information to a conversation about the text. What I want to say about connecting is that this is great if the text that you have given to your readers is something that they're familiar with culturally. So there's a great study done in America years ago where in a particular context, books were given that were outside of the cultural norms, the cultural experience of the readers. And what they found was that these children had a lot of difficulty connecting to texts that were nothing like their experiences. And when the teachers were saying things like, show me a connection, tell me a connection that you had, when the children didn't have a connection, they felt that there was something wrong with their comprehension. Why can't I connect to this? So wonderfully, these researchers have brought forward this idea of disconnections. And the right that we have to read a text that perhaps is outside of our own cultural experience and say, no, that's not like my life. I have a disconnection. My experiences don't support that kind of environment. You know, and considering that the majority of texts in our libraries and our classrooms are, you know, middle-class white families with mum, dad, 2 children and a dog or cat, many of our pupils will find it difficult to make those connections. So 2 things need to be going on there. Look at your classroom library, look at your library and see, do you have access to books about diverse populations? If you don't, something needs to be done to improve that. And secondly, if you're providing access to text to particular cultural minorities in your classroom that are very much about the white middle class family, then allowing for disconnections is an important way to value the difference in experience that these children would have had. And it can be very empowering to them to say, no, my experience of eating a meal doesn't look like that. My experience looks like this. So that's a disconnection, but it doesn't mean that my experience is wrong. Right, so an incredibly broad and quick intro to this idea of comprehension. I hope that what this gives you is this notion that just understanding a text is probably not what we need to define comprehension as. What we need to think about is it being an active process that readers have to go through if they're given the right tools with which to do that. And that two different types of factors can influence how well that comprehension goes. Some things that are inside me as the reader, including motivation, whether I have comprehension skills and strategies, my background knowledge, my vocabulary, my fluency. On the other side of things, the text influences how successful I'm going to be. Is it a text type or a genre that I'm familiar with, that I understand, that I can make predictions about what's going to come? Am I aware of the grammatical features of that text to help me? Am I aware of the text features? Do I know how to use a contents page, a glossary, read tables, captions, and things like that? And do I understand how text can be structured, not just on a broad level of the generic structure, but on the structure of the paragraphs almost, and how they're either telling me a story about describing something, sequencing something, cause and effect, problem solution, or I always forget the fifth one. I know I said a different one this time. Oh my goodness, it'll be below. It's a complicated thing to be able to comprehend. Think about what's going on in the heads of your pupils as you ask them to read something and then answer those questions, or read something and then retell. It's an amazing thing happening.